Well, I'm a cognitive linguist, and I kind of specialize in looking at models of lexical semantics and grammatical constructions that are cognitively realistic, that use kinds of categories and processing that we know people actually do. And other than that, the last few years, I've been very interested in working on viewpoint, and that is interacting with the metaphor work and also with some work on co-speech gesture.
Great.
If you're a humanist, the chances are that you think that cognitive science is all this lab stuff and it's all about so-called universal human cognition, where universal human cognition means based on college students in labs. I mean, American college students or European college students in labs. And that doesn't sound very interesting for trying to investigate distant cultures. But if instead you imagine a cognitive linguistics that's really interested in examining cultural models and cultural differences and cross-linguistic comparison and a typology and examining where there are commonalities and where there aren't as a matter of factual investigation rather than just assuming universals, then you could see that that might be useful to reading distant texts where all you have is the texts you've got and the archaeology or whatever, the history if it's a written period. How do you guess what the author meant? All too often we read in the models that we have, right? So how do we avoid that? Well, obviously the archaeology and the history and the laws are important, but also there might be times we could say, you know, like, I haven't found an exception to humans doing that. Maybe those guys did too. It's a guess, right? So in that respect, we don't think humans have changed in how they're able to use metaphor. We don't think they've changed in how they take physical viewpoint and perception. We don't think they've changed in their memory resources, probably, although if they're trained in oral tradition, maybe they are. So there's many ways in which we think that they would really have commonalities and that we might be able to, at need, capitalize on those in looking at ancient texts. My interest here is that cognition is essentially, if you look at cognitive science, the more we've looked for the last couple decades, the more we find that cognition is essentially viewpointed. And this isn't exactly surprising. None of us has a, quote, God's eye viewpoint, but nonetheless, that is the case. So what we have to talk about is viewpointed concepts. So how could language be anything other than viewpointed? Now, to me, the really fascinating thing is that we not only live in our viewpointed interaction with the world, but we live in a multi-viewpointed interaction with the world. So I can't be in a room with another human being and treat it as if it was an empty room that had a chair sitting where the human being is sitting. Right? I cannot but be aware of what that human being can see, hear, touch, reach, do, and so on. And that appears to be, at least partly, due to the mirror neuron system in our brain, which actually signalizes the same actions in other people as in us. So some, not all, of course, of the neurons that fire when I reach out and grasp something fire when I watch you reach out and grab something as well. If it was all of them, I would be hallucinating that I was reaching when I saw you. But we're very good at this. But what that means is that essentially we're inhabited by multiple viewpoints physically. We can't help having multiple viewpoints. So it's not too surprising that we get narrative with multiple viewpoints. So free and direct style classically has a past tense, which is the narrator's past. It would be the present of the focal character. Third person, referring to the focal character, that's the narrator's third person. We're not saying I, but now and here, which are the characters now and here, as in she was now working at Berkeley, where, oh, wait a minute, this is a past narrative, but the now is the character's now. So it's common in modern prose in the West to create these mixed viewpoint structures that give us the feeling that we're directly accessing some aspect of the focal character, but through the narrator, right? So a dual viewpoint structure, which is fascinating for mental spaces theory. And all of this is reflected in grammar. So deixis, the here and now, and the past tense and tense, pronouns, she as opposed to I, right? All of those things reflect spatial viewpoint and location of ego in a matrix. And also the ability to shift centers. So you might say, please come to my party, and I would say, I'd love to come to your party. Where that come, when you say, please come to my party, the come is the classic meaning of come, which is towards the speaker. But then I say, oh, I'd love to come to your party. And I have shifted the viewpoint of come onto the addressee. And not every language can do that with their come verb. So descriptions, so that rat would not get away so easily this time, right? Which characters would use the description, that rat? We know it's that character's viewpoint. Daddy will be home soon. Oh, which character would call that person daddy? We now know who's talking. And this gets almost unnoticed in narrative. And here's where I think we've got things we can look in the ancient narratives about as well. Anna Bonifaci's been doing work on British detective stories. And in these detective stories, you might have a character named, let's say, Jane Morris. And then the classic progression is that the discourse analysts talk about is you start out by saying, Dr. Jane Morris or whatever. Then you say Jane, maybe, if that's a focal character. And then just she, right? But in these stories, we go back to Jane Morris. We go back to Jane. Or maybe we say the journalist or Ms. Morris. Why? Oh, I'm following some other focal character right then, and that character would call her Ms. Morris. So I've gone back from the narrator's she to the other character's appellation. And this is so ordinary that we don't even notice it happening, but it's quite complex and interesting. And then there's basically any evaluation is somebody's evaluation. So if I say that was an amazing performance, oh, somebody has to have thought it was amazing. Who would it be? And Anna Bonifaci also has a passage from Homer where Hecuba is choosing the most beautiful robe to give to Athena. We're saying, well, okay, who thinks it's the most beautiful robe, right? She was told to pick the most beautiful robe. It must be her judgment, right? And maybe Homer agrees, is backing her judgment, but still, right, there's a character there. When every time you hear somebody use an evidential, so if they say, who heard that? Who's reporting it? Apparently. Oh, apparent to whom? It got reported, right? Say apparently the U.S. and Wales tied. Oh, and you're going to ask me, where did you see that? Oh, it happens. The New York Times was streaming it this afternoon, right? That's where my apparently comes from. So every time I get an evidential, and every language has those, right? So every language is going to be giving us some information. And then I just want to mention pronouns because they're my latest pet. So when you say we, you're defining a group that you're identifying yourself as part of. And that could be as simple as what I call event-defined groups. That is the three of us in this room, that's we. Or the people who were at the workshop, that's we. But it could also mean linguists. Okay, so I could say, a lot of people don't like linguists because they're so fascinated by picky language details. Well, there's no fixed set of people. It's an identity that I'm having with, right? So it could be a national identity, it could be Americans, it could be teachers, it could be whatever, and all of those could be we. And people might object to being included. That, what do you mean, we, white man? So are you including me in your Americanness with whatever it carries with it? But still, there's just a lot more to pronouns and identity. Now, in New Testament texts, there's just not a lot of explicit viewpoint by what most narratologists would be looking for. Right, they're relatively simple narratives, relatively simple syntax typically, following iconic sequential structure. So they don't have typically flashbacks. I forgot to tell you that before that Abraham did such and such, no. So traditional storytelling, no free and direct style. But you're constantly having to wonder why a character does something, and that's going to force you to take a viewpoint. And Bonnie Howe and I did some work on the parable of the Compassionate Samaritan. If we didn't have an idea of, let's say, neighbor that's more particular than the one we've got now, and we have some understanding that I think is shared, like the people that are your neighbors, whatever that is, right, are the people who you would owe some help to, and they would help you, probably live in your vicinity, right? So there's some things shared between these understandings, but when all these other people refuse to help this poor guy, and you clearly must at some point be taking the poor guy's viewpoint, right? He's being walked by, as well as the viewpoint maybe of these people that don't want to get involved. Like, why do they walk by? Right? Are they scared of getting involved in a criminal scene? Do they just not want the trouble? Right? So you're invited, no one talks about their viewpoint, but you're like forced to think about the viewpoint, because otherwise, why would you say this guy's better if you didn't attribute like less good motives to the ones that passed him by, right? So then it's the unneighborly one, right? It's the one who does not belong to the same community who does the neighborly thing and helps out and so on. And now we have to switch back to the viewpoint of the people that the story is being told to, right? So which of these guys was his neighbor? All right, and that question was the answer to the question that was asked before, right? Love your neighbor. What does that mean? Oh, okay. Now I'll tell you a story. So now that you've lived through those different viewpoints, now what is your viewpoint on the question of what love your neighbor means? Okay. And there we have also, I think, the implicit viewpoints in that discourse as well, of the questioner who's sort of being difficult, right? And of Jesus, who's not only taking the questioner at their word, but giving them this rather moving story to make them question further what the concept of neighbor means. So nobody talks about what any of these people thought, but without constructing viewpoints, which you need local cultural, you need to understand that travel was way more dangerous and difficult, right, than it is now, and so on. But nonetheless, without constructing viewpoints, you can't make sense of the story at all.